Hello, I'm Tucker Lieberman, and thank you to Dr. Sam Hurst for inviting me here. I'm talking about Wicked Eunuchs literary caricatures. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I did study humanities in college, but that is not really why I'm here today, and I am not a career academic, so you do not have to call me doctor because I do not have that title. I read a lot of books, so I'm going to be telling you about the books I like to read. And if you are wondering if I am trans, the answer is yes. That is fine if you want to refer to me that way online or anywhere else. You can also just say that I'm a man. You can call me a transgender man, or that I am transgender. All those words go together. They can be abbreviated. That is fine. And people call me he. So why I've been interested in representations of eunuchs is the explanation of why I did all this reading and why I'm here today. So I think it's helpful if I tell you why I'm interested, because your mileage may vary. You may have agreements, disagreements, have your own reasons why you're here. These are my 10 reasons. When I transitioned in the 1990s, I had some difficulty finding material about being transgender or being a transgender man specifically, or finding material that spoke to me. And the material that ended up speaking to me personally often used the older term eunuch, which is a totally different term. But I felt that there was some resonance, some relevant similarity between the word eunuch and my conception of being trans. And yes, I make this complicated for myself because that's how my brain works. I like it when things are complicated. That's how it ends up as a presentation. So the thing about the gender identity of being a man, say, is that I'm aware that I could have a female body and still identify as a man. So I don't see the gender of man, which is the gender I live in, as necessarily being a reflection of my body. But the term eunuch, I think, is more of a physical term. So I'm not trying to tell people how they should use it. I'm just saying the way I've heard it used is a description of people's bodies. So someone could say they want to be a eunuch, or they feel like their body is a eunuch body in certain ways. But the way I've heard it used, I don't really see much sense in saying that a female-bodied person could be a eunuch. I just don't hear it used that way. But you are invited to disagree with me if you have some different information or opinion about that. So when we ask the question, is it possible to be a female eunuch? People often get this book by Germaine Greer. It was a popular book, and it still comes up a lot in search engines. What it's about, though, is the idea that in a consumerist or sexist culture, women have their autonomy taken away, so they feel metaphorically castrated. And that is not really what I'm talking about today. I'm more focused on the literal sense of castration. So eunuch usually means someone who's born male and is later castrated in childhood or adulthood. Could mean chemical castration today, but the fiction I'm looking at was written, say, more than 100 years ago, and people didn't have a sense of chemical castration, so they're going to be talking about a more anatomical form of castration. Also, sometimes it means intersex, someone who's born with both male and female characteristics or something ambiguous. So they might call themselves someone who's born a eunuch. And so you can want to have that body or not want to have that body, or accept it or not accept it. But I think the term is usually about the body. Sometimes, though, it does refer to a gender category. And I got the word third gender up there, which I put in quotes. The reason I think third gender is a little bit of a funny term is that some cultures have more than 3 genders. And so then how are you going to number them? Which one's third gender? But also because people can have different labels for sex and gender, and those can be overlapping. So when I say that I'm a transgender man, what I mean is I've got like a sort of double vision where I can see things as a man, or I can see them as a transgender person, or both at the same time. So it's not like being a transgender man doesn't really feel like a third gender category, because in a sense, it's sort of a binary man-woman thing for me, but in another sense, it's something else. And so I feel like, eunuchs might experience that too. So this thing, just quickly about spirituality, is that I felt like in my culture, there were not a lot of words for loss and grief and limits and things that we just cannot get in this lifetime. The term transgender tends to be very forward focused, I find, and very focused on what you can achieve and how you can change your body and define yourself. But there are also, I find, limits in our human life. We can't always have everything we want. So I think that's one reason why the term eunuch appealed to me. It was the part of the serenity prayer that is serenity to accept the things I cannot change. In that sense, the word eunuch resonated with me on that level. So in fiction about eunuchs, sometimes authors will assume that if someone is castrated, they've had a loss and therefore they should have some gain that balances it. And what I've heard people say about this from the perspective of, say, chronic illness and disability is that they might gain something from their experience of their physical limitations or their differences, but they also might not gain anything or what they were expected to gain. So say a blind person might be excellent at music, but also might not be excellent at music. It's really individual. And so if we start with assumptions, we're going to end up with stereotypes. Just because it happens to one person doesn't mean it happens to another person. And I think that's interesting to keep in perspective when we're talking about fiction. Like, why does the novelist write a eunuch character? They could have written some other character. Do they think the eunuch has a particular personality trait just because he's castrated? And that's something you can look at from the lens of disability. Also, if the eunuch does have compensatory powers for his castration, are any of those skills magic skills? Because often you see the eunuch is supposed to be some kind of wizard. Somehow his castration gives him occult knowledge. And there might be a certain logic of sacrifice there, like sacrifice works as a kind of bargain on the spiritual level. So this is kind of simple, and I just think it's worth saying quickly. Literary sympathy. We read fiction because we want to sympathize with characters sometimes, and we sympathize with someone who's had something go wrong for them. So that's why we might sympathize with a eunuch character. And we can also draw inspiration from them, whether or not it's pity or some other kind of sympathy. We can relate to them as human beings for the specific struggles that they have. Some of us like reading fiction about eunuchs or like coming to talks about fiction about eunuchs because we like being weird for its own sake. Not everyone wants to read a novel with a eunuch in it. And if we think of ourselves as interested in unusual things, as I do, we're curious about that. And also because some of us are a little bit morbid and we get excited when it can be a sort of horror aesthetic or something that's a little bit provocative. The hidden knowledge is, a certain kind of treasure hunt. If no one is reading the book about the eunuch that's in the library, that is a stone that is unturned, and we might want to turn it because something very important might be in that book. This is an image I found that kind of interests me because it's got a unicorn and the unicorn has wings. And in speculative fiction, when we see a magical creature like that, it's a sort of signifier that tells us what kind of world it is. We know just by looking at this that this world works a certain way. The horse can fly, so some of the rules of physics are bent a little bit. The horse has got a horn, the horse might be magic, so forth. But we also see in the corner, there's a little human being there, which intrigues me because it makes me think like, well, if I'm reading a book and there's a supporting character in the distance who's a eunuch, what does that mean? Like, are we focusing on the possible meaning of that. Certain kinds of science like this can be made up. The unicorn's made up, doesn't exist in the real world, but a eunuch is real. There are eunuchs in our world. There have been eunuchs in our world for all of human history, which is just like, it's a fascination for me because when you think about it, it means that there are things in this world that are not what we talk about every day, not what we acknowledge every day. And it just makes the world a more interesting place. So that's why I've been interested in representations of eunuchs. And the last one, which I will come back to later, is our sense of modern progress. So in a sense, I'm talking about things like that have already happened. I think it is fairly true to say that, we have less slavery in the world today than we had 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And also we have more science in this world right now. But regardless of whether that's actually true, it's also true. It's part of a narrative that we would like to have, the progress we'd like to see in the world. And I think that does relate to things about gender and sex as well. Like there's a general narrative about the political progress we'd like to see, the scientific progress we'd like to see. Gender and sex is a part of that. There is a book by Howard Chang who has studied about the eunuch system that was in China that ended 1912 about, and how that relates to modern conceptions of being transgender. And this book, After Eunuchs, talks about that, and I think it is instructive because it puts a continuous historical narrative on what eunuchs have been, what trans people are now, how we see ourselves. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the fiction. In Eutropium, Against Eutropius. This was a poem written by Claudian. He was a Roman satirist, among other things. And what happened was there was a eunuch in Rome, Eutropius. He served Emperor Theodosius, who died in 395, the year 395. The Roman Empire then split in half because Theodosius gave half to one of his sons and the other half to the other son. And the western half of the Roman Empire didn't survive as a political entity. It's what Europe is today. But the eastern half of the Roman Empire did survive as the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, and then it became the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim. So Eutropius the eunuch went on to serve Arcadius in the east, and he had a military victory. So he was rewarded by being made patrician and consul, just a rank. But this was disputed because people were not happy that a eunuch was made consul. So Arcadius decided to reverse that, stripped him of his rank, and exiled him. And the poet Claudian wrote this screed against Eutropius, basically making fun of him for being a eunuch, but also worse than that. Eutropius was said to be moved by no natural affection, including family bonds, abusive to his own kind, which are other eunuchs, super greedy, super cruel, interested only in money, which is the only passion his mutilated body can indulge, quote unquote. This passage is just astounding, so I will read it. Let the world cease to wonder at the births of creatures half human, half bestial, at monstrous babes that affright their own mothers, at the howling of wolves heard by night in the cities, at beasts that speak to their Estonian herds, at stones falling like rain, at the blood-red threatening storm clouds, at wells of water changed to gore, at moons that clash in mid-heaven, and at twin suns. All portents pale before our eunuch consul. Meaning, a castrated man with political power is worse than any supernatural horror I can imagine, and it will draw the wrath of the gods. Claudian was saying, if you have to promote a slave, can you at least make it a man? Or my second choice, he says, would be a woman, less disgraceful to Rome, but are you actually going to promote a eunuch? He said, we know of no people who endure a eunuch's rule. So that's not maybe exactly true because there are some eunuch rulers that we can find in history, but this is rhetorical. So he calls Eutropius things like a half man, a dog, an ape, and ultimately says the monster itself must be sacrificed. What happens when you say things like that politically? Eutropius was executed. He was kind of already on that trajectory anyway because he was already exiled, but this poem did not help. If we fast forward 1,000 years, we see people having different kinds of political arguments about eunuchs. Eunuchism displayed is an argument about whether eunuchs should be allowed to marry. And this particularly centered on, say, the Italian castrato singers. That was the writer's understanding of what a eunuch was. And so, they're active in the opera and they're visible on the street. And the question is, if you have this person at a dinner party, is he a man and is he allowed to marry a woman legally? It is debated in the same way that there has been a same-sex marriage debate in more recent years. So this book mostly discusses eunuchs in Europe, has a couple references to the Ottoman Empire, but not really anywhere else in Africa, Asia is discussed. He was aware of Claudian's poem, and he's making a similar type of argument, maybe not quite so vicious, but still potentially damaging. He says, maybe eunuch was once a title of honor, but now it's an insult. Eunuchs are no better than slaves. And if any are great men, they are an exception to that rule. So he's sort of defining rather than arguing. He's saying it's not possible for a eunuch to be great because if he is, he's an exception. And he says you can't even make a defense of eunuchs because everyone already knows what the conclusion is. And castration is a terrible practice that should be abolished. So of course they should not be allowed to get married. Then he says what God is allowed to do. If God is going to give someone a fertility miracle, he would give that fertility miracle to an uncastrated man and a woman. He would never give the fertility miracle to a castrated man. And so that's why eunuchs should not be allowed to marry, because they will never have children. God will not help them. So argument is, since eunuchs don't have normal sexuality, therefore their marriages are public fictions. He thinks the eunuch is just after the wife's money. The wife is going to have affairs with other men. So the argument is bad because, of course, anyone can have a bad marriage. This is not a risk that is unique to being castrated. And the general argument has been used to talk about gay marriage. A gay person might have a bad marriage, but that doesn't really mean that no one should be allowed to have a gay marriage. If you are interested in learning about a particular eunuch's marriage, there's a good biography called The Castrato and His Wife by Helen Berry. It's about the singer Tenducci who did elope with a teenager in the 1700s. So now I want to say something about Orientalism, the book and the idea that was coined and expanded in the book by Edward Said in 1978. What he was talking about is a British and French perspective primarily, also a United States perspective in somewhat lesser degree, of how a region that's been called the Orient has been part of material civilization, he puts it, capitalism, colonialism, an actual material either invasion or exploitation or just commerce, some kind of dialogue, and how that shows up in representations of the region. Even the concept that there is a singular region called the Orient, because there are many cultures. And if you're looking at some place called the East, well, the East is half of the globe. So it's like, how does the brain divide the globe into half and make perceptions about West and East? It's part of the question he's asking. In large part, that is done through a system of ideological fictions that is not necessarily trying to be accurate. It is often scholarly, but the facts that are generated by the scholarship may or may not be true. And he says that the Orientalist portraits, these portrayals, are made by Europeans for Europeans. And by US Americans as well. So in these perspectives, the East is often presented as a mirror image of post-Enlightenment Europe, he says, meaning that the West is considered to be normal and say oriented towards science, and the East might be presented as more religious, so it's the mirror image of science, something like that, or more about a certain kind of government that isn't liberal democratic government. It's presenting an other, basically. So having said that, I want to share the story of Vathek by William Beckford. He wrote this in 1786, one of the earliest Gothic fictions, and it is also Orientalist. Here is a picture of the author. So his father died when William Beckford was a boy. And William Beckford inherited a fortune that came from plantations in Jamaica, where his father and others had enslaved 3,000 people. And those people continued to labor on those plantations, and he took the money from it. He didn't ever travel to Jamaica, so he never saw the plantations, he never met the people. He took the money and he used that money to live a lavish lifestyle. He could not follow his father's footsteps into politics because he had a male lover and people found out about it, and that was difficult for him. He knew how to read Persian, Arabic, Latin, and Greek. And he wrote this novel, Vathek, supposedly in 3 days in French. It was first published, though, several years later. He wrote it at age 21, and it was published around the time he was 24 or so, published in English. The novel is based on these characters, Vathek and Caricatures. They are based on historical people, Al-Wathek and his mother Caricatures, in 9th century Baghdad. So right at the beginning of Islam. These were real rulers, but apart from that, it's hard to say exactly how much of it is historical because it's a rather silly story. So the fictional Vathek is a narcissist. He has a rogue eyeball whose gaze can kill people. At the beginning of the story, he builds a tower with 11,000 stairs, and he goes up there to contemplate astrology. So I made this graphic because I wondered how big a tower with 11,000 stairs would be. I just could not imagine it. Statue of Liberty and Big Ben are really tiny in the corner. There's the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building. And the building with 11,000 stairs would be like 3 times taller than that. So he had to stop, because if he had not stopped, then his construction workers would have needed oxygen tanks. And up there, he thinks he's found a prophecy. This is Vathek, who's up at the top of his tower. He issues a proclamation. Bring any traveler to me. This traveler is going to be part of my prophecy. So they bring him a traveler. And that man sells him some sabers that have mysterious lettering on them. And the traveler laughs at him, the way it's described. His long amber-colored teeth bestreaked with green. There's something magical and different about this man. Vathek tries to kill him with his eyeball, doesn't work, throws him in jail, but this man escapes because he's magic. Vathek asks people to translate the sabers. He says, I'll kill you if you fail, but then people tell him that's too harsh. They say, make it better. Just say the eunuchs will burn your beard if you fail. So one man tells him the sabers do have a good message, but then the letters change because they're magical. Now he's saying it's a bad message. Vathek is upset. He becomes physically ill, loses his appetite. And the original merchant comes back and says, I'm going to give you a potion for the healing of mind and body. Vathek brings up this chief eunuch, Baba Baluk. It's, I think, the first time he's mentioned the story. He says, protect the harem ladies from this traveler. So that mostly creating just an atmosphere, giving you a sense of how eunuchs are brought into stories. The next morning, the visitor rolls up, does some somersaults. The palace staff are playing kickball with him, and he rolls into a deep canyon. Vathek camps at the edge of the canyon, and he hears the voice of the Jawar, that is this merchant, calling from the earth. And the Jawar asks Vathek to renounce his religion, pledge your devotion to me instead, and you'll receive treasures in the palace of subterranean fire. So Vathek says, okay, I'm going to renounce Islam. And that's when he beheld the earth open. This is a quote from the novel. And at the extremity of a vast black chasm, a portal of ebony. This is not really a good situation. This is some magic that you don't want to be doing. The Jawar demands a sacrifice now of 50 sons of Vathek's noblemen. So Vathek and his eunuchs, this is the role of the eunuchs now, to do whatever Vathek tells them to do, lure the boys to the canyon, push them over the edge. So the 50 boys have been sacrificed. The eunuchs congratulate each other on their disability of ever being fathers, which basically means in this situation, they're glad they did not have sons because their sons would have been sacrificed too. So if you think that Vathek is now going to get his reward, nope. The jar has no intention of accepting that sacrifice and making it so easy for Vathek. And now the boys' parents want to kill Vathek. Caricatures, his mother, shoos them away. And Caricatures has got some magical elements. She has mummies brought from the catacombs of the ancient pharaohs, the oil of the most venomous serpents and rhinoceros' horns. And so they climb up the tower of 11,000 stairs and burn these ritual items. The eunuch, Baba Baluk, is said to know what a burning mummy smells like. For some reason, he is, quote unquote, more familiarized to magical odors. And he tries to reassure people, no, the tower's not burning, you see a fire up there, but it's all okay. Some people want to be volunteer firefighters, so they carry water buckets up the 11,000 stairs, and Vathek and Caricatures murder them when they get there because that's just the way they are. And the jar asks Vathek, okay, make a luxurious journey to Istakar, bring your most faithful slaves and your best beloved wives, and I will give you all these treasures. And Caricatures does all the preparation because she's mom who takes care of things. She buys up lots of fancy fabric and she's planning to dress up the eunuchs. And she also invites ladies for dinner and releases live snakes and scorpions on them. And Vathek is just a blasphemer. He's less involved in this, but he does it his own way. So they're going on their journey, and this comment about the eunuchs, they say the eunuchs start to scream because some men are in the women's chariots, and so the eunuchs decide they're going to castrate the people who did this. That's not really significant to the story, but it gives flavor. It's saying what impressions of eunuchs were, that as part of eunuchs' job guarding women, if you are a man who enters the women's space, the eunuchs will castrate you too, and they'll make you a eunuch too. That's the implicit threat. Right, so they're on the road and they're attacked by tigers and wolves, and chariots cast fire and they have to go on foot. So almost at the end, Vathek's party receives hospitality, and the way Vathek repays this hospitality is to try to seduce the man's daughter, Nur-Nahar. And the man is not happy. He tries to help his daughter escape, and he drugs her along with her fiance in the hopes that they'll wake up somewhere and be able to escape. That did not happen because Nur-Nahar decides she likes Vathek better, and she's going to go back to him. This is a painting by John Singer Sargent in 1910. He called it Princess Nur-Nahar. It's a direct reference to this novel, which he enjoyed. So at this point, it's time for them to go to hell because they've been so terrible their whole life. And Vathek is there, and the girl Nur-Nahar is there, and they realize it's a trap. They're stuck in hell. Vathek blames his mother because his mother helped him with all this devil worship, and he sends for her so that she can come to hell too. The last thing Caricatures wants to do on Earth is hang the eunuch Baba Baluk because, I mean, for whatever reason. She says the eunuch was doing bad things, like trying to marry off Vathek's wife in his absence, so she wants him hanged. And that's the end, and Vathek and his allies burn in hell forever. So what we get from that, I mean, partly it's an aesthetic, but implicitly, I think it also tells us what William Beckford thought the role of eunuchs was in a society like this, which is 9th century Iraq. The eunuch is there to do the bidding. He's basically the henchman. If the ruler is evil and wants 50 boys pushed off a cliff, the eunuch is going to help him do that. And the eunuch is also a little bit magic. He can help with the magical rituals. The eunuch might not have been quite so evil if he were on his own. Hard to tell. Next one is Zorab the Hostage. This is by James Justinian Morier, written in 1832. He was the British ambassador to Persia years before he wrote this novel. So, you know, he's bringing some of his awareness of the region. And he based it on a real person, Aga Muhammad, who was castrated in childhood. So he was a eunuch, and was he was part of a tribe called the Qajars. And when he became Shah of Persia, he was the founder of the Qajar dynasty. And he was also known as someone who was especially ruthless in going after his enemies. So I might classify this as more of a romance adventure, but it definitely has gruesome elements to it, a lot of fight scenes, and a lot about what this terrible ruler did to keep control over all these people. The novelist says of Aga Muhammad Shah that he's beardless, but the way he's described as beardless says his face appeared like a blotch of leprosy. It could only boast of a few straggling bristles. And this was particularly noticeable in a country where beards are universally worn, as he says. So he also describes this person as having the fascination of some blood-seeking monster, bereft of its native manliness. And when people are around him, they're not sure why they feel uncomfortable all the time, but they definitely feel the sort of discomfort that they would feel in the presence of a large and venomous snake. And this guy, Aga Muhammad Shah, surrounds himself with people he considers uglier than himself because he wants to feel better about himself. So he's just violent and executes anyone who's around him. His horrid face broke into a demoniacal expression of fury. His cheeks began to bloat, the eyes seemed to roll in blood. This is generally the way he is when he gets angry for no particular reason. And he knows that his subjects see him as a monster of injustice. He has many riches. He wears two famous diamonds, the Koh-i-Noor and the Darya-Noor. One is now in the British crown, but at the time that this novel was written, it did not yet belong to Britain. It belonged, I think Britain got it from India, but at the time that this story was written, it may have been with Iran. And the Darya-Noor is still with Iran today. So that, at least the diamonds are historically based. Part of the story, he has a political rival. He captures the rival's son. He's going to marry the son to his chief executioner's daughter. The lovers are not feeling that because this rival's son is actually in love with the niece of Aga Muhammad. So Zorab, the hostage, escapes because his father rescues him. Aga Muhammad is so terrible, he orders his niece left in the wilderness to die. So then there's just a lot of fight scenes. Zorab has an opportunity to kill the Shah, but he doesn't do it. And then the Shah announces a bounty on Zorab and his father. Zorab witnesses his father die. Then they're just arguing. The Shah says, "You're a dog," and Zorab says, "No, you're the father of dogs." And then there's this scene where Aga Muhammad Shah is counting eyeballs. He says, "Bring me exactly the number of eyeballs I request, or else I'll take yours too." And he's given a sack of eyeballs, and he's got them on a tray, and he's counting them to make sure they're all there. And the Shah orders Zorab to be executed, but that is not to happen because the Shah has gotten too many enemies by now, so he is beheaded. And we can feel safe that the lovers can be together. So that story, I would say, is just an example of a political eunuch who did have a lot of political power, but is also extraordinarily evil. And it's historically based, but also playing up the terribleness of the violence. Next one is Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. Later in the 1800s, he had traveled to Carthage and took some inspiration from the land that he visited. Here's Carthage on a map. It's in what is today Tunisia. So Carthage is in purple. And this map is showing 2,000 years ago, Carthage had had conquests and territory in Europe. So it's about a war that was happening, 3rd century BCE. And we can tell the story. It's a love story between Matho and Salammbô. It's a weird love story because Matho has a crush on Salambo, but she doesn't really know he exists, and he has a very strange way of showing his affections. There is also a high priest who's a eunuch, but he comes in the story in a different way. So the plot told without eunuchs. Matho breaks into the temple and steals a sacred veil called the zymph. Then he goes to Salambo while she's sleeping in bed and says, look, I stole the zymph, aren't you impressed with me? She's actually horrified because you're not supposed to steal the zymph. It's taboo to touch it or even look at it. So Matho has to escape. And then Salambo says, oh no, I got to get that sacred veil back. You can't let this guy just have it. So she comes to him while he's asleep, and she's willing to bargain her body to get it back. But Matho, for whatever reason, falls asleep, and Salambo says, that's fine, I'm just going to take the sacred veil now. She takes it and goes back to her father, Hamilcar, and he says, I'm going to betroth you to my ally. So now things are getting weird because the Carthaginian soldiers are starving. They start to sacrifice their children to the god Baal, also known as Moloch. And this, they believe, causes the war to turn in their favor. So they think the child sacrifice is working. That means they don't need Matho anymore. Matho had been a rebel who was working against Hamilcar, but now that they like the way the war is going, they don't need Matho's help anymore in any rebellion. So they torture him in the streets, and he falls dead in the presence of Salambo, who also promptly keels over and dies too, described as her divine punishment, because when she had to rescue the sacred veil from Matho, she had to touch it, and that was taboo. And so the gods have to kill her. That's the end of that story, but I didn't tell you about the eunuch, who is the high priest of the goddess Tanit. There are also other eunuchs who are priests of the goddess Tanit. They live separately. They appear ceremonially. They're also described sometimes as men, more so than they would be described as women. But they do, dress differently than other men. They're described as weaker than old women, but also as men in spirit. So there's some stereotype that's being invoked here. They worship Tanit, which is linked to the worship of a black meteorite, and that is a real historical cult, the cult of Cybele, said to have originated in Mesopotamia, and then it moved west. So you can find references to it in Greek and Roman texts. Those worshippers were probably trans women, and whether they identified as trans women before they joined the cult, and that's why they joined the cult, or whether being in the cult gave them a new gender identity. Hard to know exactly how that worked, but they seem to be trans feminine worshippers, and that cult required men, say, to castrate themselves to join it. So they became eunuchs, and that sort of explains why here in Carthage it's being called the worship of the goddess Tanit, and there's a black meteorite. Shachabarim is a very interesting person. He's just, he has shining eyes, described as wearing little bells, wearing a long robe, wearing jewels. And he also knows some magic here. He's got some magic herbs that he's using to help Salambo recover from the goddess who's turned against her. We have a little backstory on how he got castrated. It involved boiling water. He also studied at college, and he's traveled a lot, and he's one of the most educated people, and he knows that the earth is round and it's moving. He's some kind of divinity himself. He explains what the sacred veil means, and he was a sort of father figure to Salambo. Now he tells her the secret origins of the cosmos and gives her consolation when she's having nightmares. So when she is about to become a human sacrifice, Shachabarim helps her out of that. But in the process, he becomes sort of irrationally jealous. Not really clear to me why, but this strict father figure that he was, now he's becoming more mentally disturbed, and it seems to be linked to either his his identity as a eunuch or else as being a priest of Tanit. So he does, in the last scene, carve out the heart of Matho, who was dying anyway because a mob was torturing him in the street. And just before Matho expired, Shechabarim delivered the final blow, carving out his still beating heart and offering it to the sun. So we see the transformation of Shechabarim. He was a fairly normal person as the eunuch priests of Tanit go, but then he went a little bit overboard and switched sides, and now is worshiping Moloch instead of Tanit. Virgin of the Seven Daggers. I realize I am coming up to the end of the hour, so I'm going to try to go quickly. Vernon Lee, 1889. She is British, and she wrote a story because she went to Spain. She was involved with another woman poet, and they had some issue. It was kind of like a breakup. So Vernon Lee said, I'm going to Spain to get away from it. And she discovered the architecture of Spain. And she felt that the Spanish Catholicism was not an aesthetic that she liked. She thought it would be a good setting for a horror story instead. Here is a portrait by Zurbarán, who is mentioned in the story. So this is generally what the noblemen of Spain would have been looking like around this time. About Don Juan is the character, and he's praying in the church. He admits to the Virgin he has had many hundreds of affairs with women, but there's 7 ladies in particular for whom he had murdered. And he feels like that is what he will go to hell for, the 7 murders. So he's praying for salvation from the Madonna of the 7 Daggers. First eunuch in the story is Syphax. Don Juan hears the voice of Syphax, his majesty's own soprano singer, probably either Siface or Farinelli. The next thing we know, he's forgotten that he's repenting. He wants to awaken a 300-year-old princess who is said to be the daughter of the Sultan Yahya. And he hires a Jewish man to help him magically revive the 300-year-old princess so she can be his bride. This man is named Baruch, and he brings lamps, frankincense, a pound of a dead man's fat, the bones of a stillborn child who had been boiled by the witches, and so forth. They light the cauldron, they recite incantations in fake Latin, and it says, the moon was veiled, the place was lit up crimson, the earth trembles, and eventually a flame, a sheet of green lightning leaped up from the fire. Don Juan should pay Baruch for helping him with magic, but instead he pushes him off a cliff. Now he's walking through a tower looking for this woman that he believes he's successfully resurrected. And it's very creepy. It smells of dead bats. He hears the voices of his dead mistresses. And he gets to the place where the woman is. She's guarded by the dueña and the chief eunuch. And you know, they are wearing Turkish costume. And the eunuch says, this princess speaks Arabic. You don't know Arabic, so we're going to translate for you. The dead princess, through her translators, asks Don Juan, you have to swear that I'm more beautiful than your 7 mistresses. And he says, okay, I'll do that. One after the other. He says, you're more beautiful than this one, you're more beautiful than that one. The one thing he won't swear is that she is more beautiful than the Virgin of the 7 Daggers. And so the eunuch says, decapitate Don Juan, who is dragged away, and he kneels. He sees lights, including the sword and the diamonds in the chief eunuch's eye. And he feels his own decapitation. He feels his head bouncing after it's severed from his body. He wanders around, he realizes he's a ghost. The last thing he knows is that the Virgin of the 7 Daggers is lifting him to heaven as if on clusters of soap bubbles. And he hears again the voice of Syphax, his majesty's chief soprano. So there's some interesting parallels in the story where he begins kneeling in prayer and he ends kneeling for the executioner. And it's the eunuch, the Muslim eunuch, who orders him to be decapitated, and it's the Virgin who saves him. Exactly how Islam and Catholicism might be in conflict here, it's hard to say. Maybe they're even complementing each other. Something we could think about. And if we want information about how eunuchs were racialized and segregated in the Ottoman Empire, especially in the court of the Sultan. George June has a book on this, published a few years ago, called The Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire. How many minutes? I got a couple minutes. Eunuch of Istanbul by Dennis Wheatley, 1935. He wrote lots of popular fiction. So this book is not available free online, I don't think, because it's not public domain yet, not quite old enough, but you can definitely find mass market paperbacks that are still floating around out there. I have 2 of them because I'm greedy. Okay, so quickly, I have a couple of pictures, maps of the Ottoman Empire, just to give a sense that this was an empire that lasted multiple centuries. It got bigger before it got smaller. And this might be understood geopolitically as one of the stressors happening around the time of the First World War, that the Ottoman Empire was seen as being weak. It was seen as not being able to defend its territory. So then there were questions about, well, who's going to come in and take over that power vacuum? And I mean, that just gives us context for understanding the story. There was a Young Turk revolution that said, we do not want to have sultans anymore. We would rather have a constitution, and started in 1908 and kept going for the next 15 years or so until the Sultan left. The Eunuch of Istanbul was published in 1935, so it reflects the fact that the Sultan had already left office and then died several years later. There was a film made of it. You can see it online, The Spy in White. Story. The characters begin at a diplomatic dinner honoring a nephew of the late Sultan, Prince Ali of Turkey. And there's an English officer, Swithin Destine, who hears a woman, Diana Duncannon, screaming that there's some unwanted advance from a man. So he rushes over and punches out the man, and then realizes he's just punched Prince Ali himself. So Swithin thinks, I don't know how I'll get a job. I'm merely fluent in Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. And the woman, Diana, her father, says, well, you defended my daughter's honor, so I'm going to send you to work for my tobacco company in Istanbul. He wants him to be a sort of spy and tell him what's happening politically in Istanbul. So this is more of spy fiction now. Swithin doesn't know what he's doing. He's hanging out in bars, listening to people say things politically, and is getting into lots of trouble. The eunuch, you can see in the screenshot, is standing on the left. The eunuch, Kazdim, is the chief of police in Istanbul. And he's now threatening Swithin and one of his friends. If I hear you talking politics anymore, I'm going to throw you down this hole, and the hole goes into the river and you will be drowned. This is what the eunuch looks like. That's the actor playing him. Kazdim was not messing around. He throws Raouf down the hole. And then the day after that, he also throws Swithin down the hole, but Swithin miraculously survives. He's captured and he escapes being captured with a ladder. That is the kind of story this is. And he realizes, oh, now I understand. Prince Ali, the Sultan's nephew, and Kazdim are working together because the only way they're going to have power is if there can be a caliphate again. If Prince Ali can be Sultan and Kazdim can be the chief eunuch, and Turkey is the way it used to be, they're going to be happy because they have power. They don't want it to be a modern democracy. Kazdim, how he's described, we don't have his backstory. We don't know how he ended up as a eunuch. We do know that he's abusive. He's also described as a snake, as we've heard before with other characters. He's described as sinister and evil. His face is a mask of unutterably cruel enjoyment when he has to execute someone. We also know he speaks in a high falsetto. There are a large number of fatphobic references to his weight. He's also referred to as a eunuch with a capital E, so that suggests it's a title, not just a physical condition. But he's sometimes referred to as a man as well. And a book I can suggest in reference to this era, that is the era between World War I and World War II, is The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris, came out this year. It's a biography of a plastic surgeon. I think it's interesting because Lindsay Fitzharris is talking about how surgery advanced during this time, that in World War I, veterans had a lot of facial injuries and they needed facial reconstructions. So there's a surgeon, Harold Gillies, who did their facial reconstructions. And in World War II, he realized that people also needed genital reconstructions. So he was doing those for veterans. And that's how he came to do one of the earliest phalloplasties for a trans man in the late 1940s. Where I am, I'm almost at the hour. I guess I can quickly run through the rest of these slides, but I will try to be super quick. Books with eunuch characters I like. Here's a couple. Equal of the Sun by Anita Amirzvani. This is about a eunuch who he's a full character. He reflects on his gender and his being as a person in the world. And a new one came out last year, She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, who has just won some awards. There's a eunuch general in here. My headcanon eunuchs. Funny that I'm clearing my throat just as I approach this one. This scene in The Princess Bride, the albino, he's known as the albino, that's just the name of his character. When we first meet him, he clears his throat in a way that I think is meant to suggest that we're meant to assume that he's a eunuch because he has a high voice or a strangled sounding voice, but then he clears his throat and he has a lower male register. So that's supposed to be a funny joke, but I think to me, it also codes him as a eunuch. And you can see his job is to be the torturer. He takes orders and tortures people. In the Dark Crystal, the Skeksis put the Gelflings and the Podlings in a sort of restraint, and they drain them of their vital essence, which to me seems like a hybrid of both physical and chemical castration. They're turning the Podlings and the Gelflings into their slaves, kind of zombie. I have not read Dune. I'm aware that it has a eunuch, but I just have not read it yet. I would love to. So tying together some of the things I said at the beginning, where there was a certain kind of eunuch phobia. It relates to some things that people say these days against transgender people. There's a trope that is in anti-transgender speech. People will mention the word eunuch and say, well, trans people are basically just eunuchs, or they behave like eunuchs, or they're going to be used as eunuchs. Why are they making this discourse? What they claim is that, well, once upon a time, men castrated other men, so eunuchs could serve villainous purposes in a sexist society. So, quote unquote, therefore, doctors today who are helping trans people transition are really just trying to make trans people into villainous eunuchs who are reproducing gender stereotypes. I feel from my own personal experience that this is not the case, and it is just wrong. So there's a particular myth called the bathroom predator myth, the bathroom predator villain. This is a fiction saying that cisgender predators disguise themselves as trans people to enter bathrooms and assault women. This not only does not happen, it does not make any sense. I want to say that I think it relates to the false eunuch trope. There is a play by the Roman playwright Terence in which a man pretends he's a eunuch servant so that he can get into a woman's house and rape her. That was what the Romans considered comedy in the 2nd century BCE. But also it's just plain fiction. Like if it happened then, it's not happening now. That's not what trans people are. It's just NA. And one last one, Janice Raymond's 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, is an anti-transgender book. That's its entire point. I do not have the book cover here because I'm not promoting it, but I want to say she does use the image of eunuch to sort of draw some kind of parallel that she thinks exists with trans women. And she says things like, will every lesbian feminist space become a harem guarded by transsexual women or controlled by transsexual women who, in her view, are eunuchs who are trying to control all the lesbians? So not only did it not make sense then, but this was written in 1979 and trans women are not controlling lesbian spaces. So this is false. And I think probably after this presentation, we can think of our own reasons. We can make a whole list of reasons why this does not make sense and is not true. Recapping what I said at the beginning, why I'm interested in eunuchs in literature has to do with our sense of modern progress, including progress that is happening, progress we'd like to be happening, becoming more scientific and less harmfully superstitious, getting more democracy and bodily autonomy. As I mentioned at the beginning, the book After Eunuchs drew some kind of historical continuity between eunuchs, but just as eunuchs were in decline, the eunuch system was in decline. So the enslavement of eunuchs was in decline, and involuntary castration was in decline. We started to have more science and more understanding of trans people, and now that discourse of being trans is on the rise, and that experience of being trans is on the rise. So we don't castrate people to punish, subjugate, or enslave them. Hopefully we don't, or to manage sexist social systems, but we do let people manage their own hormones and genitals. We give them bodily autonomy to do that. That is the ideal. So after eunuchs, we have trans people. We do also have eunuchs. I mean, eunuchs exist, and some people identify as eunuchs. But the discourse I'm drawing a parallel between is my own experience of being trans and the historical sense of being a eunuch. Trans people are part of a narrative of social progress. And when we understand who eunuchs are, we understand more about ourselves, whether we are or are not eunuchs. We just understand more about human history, and we can have a fuller discourse about sex and gender. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.